This video is sponsored by War Thunder. 3 Germans walk into a bar. Just kidding, my German viewers, nothing insulting was intended towards you. What we're going to do here is to tell the story of the Browning automatic rifle in the way God intended, not to chew over the same few facts everyone else talks about. Instead, I'm going to tell you only the most interesting jewels of its quite dark story. So we have to start from where it all began for the BAR, which takes us back to the trenches of World War I, and the problem that was killing soldiers in alarming numbers that no existing weapon could fix. And that problem was timing and bolt-action rifles. You see, to quote-unquote soften up the enemy before the attack, there'd be a heavy artillery barrage over the trenches. But that bombardment had to stop before the friendly troops went over the top, otherwise you'd hit your own men as they advanced. And in that gap between the artillery lifted and just before the attackers actually reached the enemy trench, surviving defenders would climb out of their dugouts, set up the machine guns, and cut down the men now standing in the open just in front of their wire. So they tried to send more men to solve this, and when that didn't work because they all died anyway, they tried fire and movement tactics, where part of a unit shoots while the rest advances. This only slowed everything down, because the volume of fire of bolt-action rifles was, not really going to suppress the whole section of the trench. What armies thought they needed was a way to keep up continuous fire, like from the machine gun, while the entire assault line moved forward together, so the defenders would keep their heads down until they closed that gap and could jump into the trench. The French actually came up with a partial answer with their Chauchat. You've probably heard of it, and probably not in a flattering way due to its not so well thought through design, but it was actually the first automatic weapon that a single soldier could carry forward during an assault. French units used the Chauchat teams as mobile machine gun hunters, where they'd move to the enemy positions with suppressive automatic fire, and then finish off with grenades. The concept worked, but the weapon itself left a lot to be desired. The Chauchat was awkward to fire, with an uneven kick that fought against the shooter, and external parts snagged on everything, mud getting in the mechanism, and all that headache of a design never intended for the trench conditions. American troops got Chauchats converted to 30-06, which had even worse reliability problems, if that's somehow possible. So while the French had proven that man-portable automatic weapons could change how infantry assaults worked, they hadn't built the ideal tool for the job. Machine guns existed, of course, but their weight made them defensive weapons. You simply couldn't sprint across no man's land while dragging a water-cooled Maxim behind you, at least if you're not Rambo or Schwarzenegger. There were submachine guns, but the pistol cartridge isn't really scary enough to keep their heads down. They wanted a full-power rifle cartridge, like those bolt-action rifles were chambered in. But the problem was that such a cartridge generates a lot of energy, and the technology of the time couldn't make it work reliably in fully automatic fire in a small package, without blowing the rifle up or ending up with an overly heavy weapon that couldn't be carried by a single soldier. Not to mention the problems of recoil and overheating. The US Army looked around at alternatives for this so-called walking fire concept they had in mind, and didn't really find anything. So they went to none other than John Moses Browning. Browning was actually already working on such a rifle, even before the war when no one needed it. He wanted a rifle that would be carried by a single soldier, chambered in 30-06, which was the standard American cartridge, capable of firing in both semi and full auto, reliable under the worst battlefield conditions, and of course, fed from a magazine larger than the standard 5-round service rifles. He tried out 40-round magazines first, but they were awkward for prone firing, so a 20-round magazine was eventually chosen. But what made Browning's rifle work where all other designs failed was the gas operation. Instead of using the recoil of the whole gun to cycle the action like that beautiful-looking Chauchat, Browning drilled a tiny hole near the muzzle of the barrel, through which a small amount of the high-pressure gas after firing would get diverted. Inside that barrel is a piston that the gas pushes back, which is connected to the bolt, so it cycles the action. Once the bolt is pushed all the way back, it extracts the spent casing, gas vents out, and the spring pushes everything forward again to load. And as long as you hold the trigger, the rifle fires the next round. This system could now manage the full power cartridge, and with the open bolt design, Browning solved the overheating problem as well. When not firing, the bolt stays open, which lets air go through the heavy barrel and cool it a bit, and the round is also not sitting in the hot chamber where it could cook off. Plus, the open bolt is mechanically simpler, which gives you more reliability in the field. There's more to the design than this, of course, but we're going to keep it simple, because I suppose you're not really as weird as I am when it comes to all the little things about how this rifle works. Now let's talk for a moment about today's sponsor, because honestly it fits this channel almost too perfectly. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and the best part is that it's completely free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox and mobile. And when I say comprehensive, I mean over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 major nations, going from 1920s biplanes all the way to modern jets and main battle tanks, all with detailed vehicles, realistic graphics and authentic sound effects. So pretty much any vehicle we've ever talked about on this channel, you can climb into and take for a spin yourself. Every vehicle is modelled down to its individual components, all the way to the crew inside. And when something gets destroyed, there's this X-ray view showing you exactly where the shell went in and what killed the vehicle, which is the coolest thing about it. There's even a full mobile version on iOS and Android. Here's the deal. Go play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile using my links in the pinned comments or video description. And if you're a new player or a returning one who hasn't played in the past 6 months, you'll also get a massive bonus and anyone returning after at least 6 months that away includes the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, 7 days of premium accounts, plus a few premium vehicles and other goodies on top. It's available for a limited time only, so don't sit on it, grab it now, and I'll see you on the battlefield. Now, Browning really thought about how this rifle was realistically going to be used. I mean, just look at the fire selector for example. Safe position was closest to the shooter, and from there it easily went forward to semi-auto, and then one easy click more to full auto. You could switch from safe to fire with one finger without trouble, but putting it back on safety was much harder, so you'd really have to deliberately do it with quite a force. This was because Browning didn't want the soldier with a spiking adrenaline rush to accidentally put his rifle on safe when he wanted to switch modes of fire. The whole thing came in at 16 pounds, which was just the right balance between being heavy enough to manage the recoil and at the same time light enough to be carried in assault by one man. You'd have accurate single shots for longer range, and then fully automatic fire when you're in front of the enemy trench, exactly as the military planners wanted for their new tactic. The rifle was adopted as the model of 1918, or much better known as the Browning Automatic Rifle, and it was rushed into production. However, it wasn't rushed into combat. The thing is, no one really knew that the war would be over so soon, so General Pershing wanted to save the BAR to be a neat little surprise for the next year. The rifles were only tested on a small scale in combat, because they didn't want the Germans to capture them and then reverse engineer their copy, like they did with the Lewis gun for example. Pershing wanted to have BARs in numbers before deploying them, not to put them in little by little. So, the BAR was stockpiled in depots behind the lines, where American soldiers were given crappy Chauchat, but units that got the chance to use BARs in combat were more than pleasantly surprised by the design and how it performed in trenches. Germans were also surprised, although not in such a pleasant way, and quite a lot of them surrendered to BAR-armed units that scared them with the never-before-seen automatic fire. Oh, and by the way, John Browning's son, Val Allen Browning, was actually in the 79th Infantry Division in France, and he was among the first soldiers to carry the BAR into combat during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Anyway, the walking fire concept gave the BAR a web gear around it, like a metal cup that the gunner wore on his hip, where the buttstock would slot in to help with the recoil. There were 2 assistants with the gunner who carried belts with 11 magazines, and they were all trained to pick up the BAR if, or, when, the main gunner couldn't fire it anymore. So, these 3 guys would be supporting the attacking wave of infantry across no man's land to keep their heads down until they reached the trench. That was the theory. But before the BAR could make any war-deciding difference, the armistice came, and the war the whole tactic and rifle were built for ended. Although, the BAR proved just enough for the British and French to get interested and buy it after the war. Now, these were the years after the First World War, and America had this enormous stockpile of brand new BARs sitting around the country in military depots and National Guard armories. And these were, in many places, poorly guarded, which didn't turn out to be the best decision in the Prohibition years, the Great Depression, and the rise of organised crime. So the BAR between 2 world wars also had one dark chapter where it fell into the hands of the wrong people, and then was used in armed robberies and shootouts with policemen who were still armed with revolvers and shotguns. Criminals modified stolen BARs by sawing off stock and barrel, or even welding 2 or 3 magazines together. This became such a problem because gangs outgunned police officers. So, there came the tax for automatic weapons, and also the R80 Colt Monitor, developed for police officers to even out the gap in firepower. And the Colt Monitor was pretty much the BAR, with similar modifications to what criminals did, just made properly, in a factory. There are a few stories of BAR shootouts between the police and infamous criminals, but this isn't what this video's about. It was now time for Browning's automatic rifle to go into combat at full scale as the Second World War was about to erupt. While the United States was preparing for the war, it looked at the BARs that had been sitting in its enormous armories since 1918 and decided they could still be useful with a little bit of polishing. So, they blew the dust from them and made a few improvements, which actually only made the gun worse. The M1918A2 now got rid of the semi-auto, and instead got 2 modes of fully automatic fire, the lowest one of around 350 rounds per minute, and the higher of 650, which was intended for emergencies at close range. There go your long-ranged aimed shots. Plus, that hydraulic buffer that controlled the rate of fire made the whole thing more complicated, heavier, and prone to failure in the field. Then there was a bipod, a flash suppressor, and a hinged butt plate for prone shooting, and a monopod in the buttstock, while the original sights from the Enfield rifle, which were, by the way, really good, got replaced with worse sights for some reason. So this pushed the weight now past 20 pounds. The bipod mounted directly to the muzzle, causing the barrel to flex while firing, which killed off accuracy. They reshaped the stock and added a carrying handle because the rifle was now so much heavier, but the quote-unquote improvements, which soldiers stripped down in the field just weeks after the fighting began, weren't so much the problem as the new role they were put in. As you know, Browning designed this rifle for that walking fire concept, and now they're putting it into a light machine gun role. Only thing is, the light machine gun with a 20-round magazine that lasts about 2 seconds of continuous fire, and with no quick barrel change system, wasn't really going to work like a good light machine gun. So they pretty much crippled that rifle before going into combat. Oh, and Belgium's FN factory, where Browning worked for 15 years, actually offered the US Army a new rate of fire reducer that actually worked, paired with a quick barrel change system, which Americans promptly rejected as it was more expensive and wasn't compatible with their existing receivers. Anyway, when the war was kicked off, BAR production absolutely exploded, reaching almost 200,000 units by 1945. And instead of the light machine gun role, which obviously wasn't going to work, the BAR became the SAW. Okay, not the M249 SAW, but a predecessor of the squad automatic weapon concept. And just like in World War I, where the assistants were trained to be gunners when needed, now the whole American infantry squad had the basic BAR training, so any soldier could take over the weapon from a killed or wounded gunner. You see, the US didn't deploy light or heavy machine guns as part of the squad like the Germans did. Belt-fed machine guns, the M117, the M1919 or M2 heavy machine gun, were at company level in what was called weapon platoons. So this meant that the BAR was, except for submachine guns, the only source of automatic fire for the squad, which is why it was so important. And before you say that the Germans had much better machine guns like the MG34 and MG42, which is true if you look at the weapons side by side, the thing is that they had their 10-man squad organised around a single machine gun. And this gave them more raw automatic firepower if you measured it like that. But the American squad had more firepower overall. Each rifleman had a semi-auto M1 Garand instead of a German bolt-action Kar-98, plus the submachine guns, plus the BAR, and then the actual machine guns in the weapons platoon. So instead of getting their sole source of firepower knocked off if the single machine gun was destroyed, like would happen to the German squad, the American squad had its firepower dispersed, and it had more firepower overall. And before you guys start crucifying me in the comments saying that the Germans had the STG-44 and the FG-42, which were a distant dream of anything the Allies had, keep in mind the raw numbers. STG-44, which is the world's first assault rifle in an intermediate cartridge, was built in some 400,000 units, while FG-42, arguably the best World War II rifle, was made in only about 7,000 units. Meanwhile, bolt-action Kar-98 production before and during the war exceeded 14 million units. So you now see what the German workhorse infantry weapon was. And by the way, the Germans liked the BAR and used some 20,000 captured Polish-made versions, although mostly in secondary roles for partisan fighting, etc. However, the BAR didn't fight only Germans, but also their allies in the East, Japanese. And here's where the BAR was, perhaps, the most important weapon, if you're not counting flamethrowers and flame tanks. Marines fighting Japanese in jungle and island terrain were meeting each other at quite close distances, disturbingly often under 50 meters, or even closer. So what they needed wasn't sustained machine gun fire from the tripod, but something that could move with them through the jungle and put out a lot of rounds really fast on short notice. The Marines put the BAR guy at the point and rear of the columns on patrols to break off ambushes. And, well, the Japanese pretty quickly learned which guy in the American squad had to go first. So the casualty rate for the BAR guys was much higher than the riflemen's. The life expectancy was supposedly 30 minutes once the shooting started. But I honestly don't understand how they measure this life expectancy and how accurate it is. You might help me out in the comments. Anyway, the BAR also came in handy for the counter-sniper role, because Japanese snipers were hiding in the trees and spider holes, and the BAR gunner would spray any suspicious position the fire might be coming from with 20 rounds of good old 30-06. Which usually solved the problem. And of course, there were the banzai charges. BARs were used as the final protective lines to protect the position from being overrun by a massed infantry charge, which happened quite a few times in the Pacific. And like I compared the German squad with the American, the Japanese squad was even worse when it came to firepower. The main armament was the Arisaka Type 38 or Type 99 bolt-action rifle. And then the next stop was the Type 96 light machine gun, which was pretty primitive when you compare it to the other belt-fed machine guns of the time. There were no assault rifles or submachine guns. Even the Japanese pistols were pretty bad. So the Japanese, like the Germans, also used any captured BAR they could lay their hands on, like Belgian-made models from disarmed Chinese forces. They'd re-stamp them with the Japanese markings and issue them to their own troops. As for the American Marines in the Pacific, they pretty quickly saw how important the BAR was, and after 2 years of combat experience, they tripled the number of BARs inside the squad. Instead of 1 BAR guy per squad, there were now 3. You know, better safe than sorry. And the Japanese had to change their tactics because of this, and as the war progressed, there were fewer and fewer open frontal assaults against the American positions. They had seen what would happen. So they switched to night raids and infiltration, trying to fight as close as possible to the Marines to at least make the use of artillery risky. As for the tropical conditions wreaking havoc on all weapons, the BAR held up quite well if you maintained it religiously every day. The problem was the gas cylinder, which hasn't been upgraded to stainless steel, so it had to be cleaned daily to not rust because of corrosive ammo and a humid environment. Wooden buttstocks were another problem of every rifle, because they swelled and cracked from moisture and salt water. 20-round magazines also didn't give you the best ammo capacity in the world, but overall the BAR held up through the war well enough to get the job done. When World War II finally ended, you'd think that the United States would do something with the World War I design weapon to modernize, retire, or replace it with something modern. Nah. Despite being an obvious candidate for retirement, the BAR found itself again in the Korean War in 1950. It went into combat in the very same configuration from World War II. And despite fighting in some horrible conditions like -35 degrees cold, the BAR worked where other weapons failed because of its simpler open bolt and gas system. It fought off the Chinese human wave attacks pretty much like the Japanese Banzai charges, and was definitely preferred over the M1 Garand and M1 Carbine, still in service alongside it. By the time the Third War where it fought ended, 50 years after the BAR was designed, the US military finally began looking for something to replace the good old BAR. That was supposed to be the M14. However, they made pretty much the same mistake again, with what should have been a new universal rifle to replace the M1 Garand, Thompson, and BAR in one single weapon, chambered in the new 7.62 by 51mm NATO caliber. Who would have thought that a round pretty similar to 30-06 would be overkill for full auto in a rifle much lighter than an actual machine gun? So, like with improving the BAR, they tried to save the program with the M15, adding a heavier barrel, a bipod and a new stock, going down the same light machine gun rabbit hole, with the rifle with a 20-round magazine and no quick-change barrel system. So, after briefly entering service and fighting in Vietnam, where the BAR was still used in some roles by the way, the M14 was finally replaced by the M16 as an assault rifle in an intermediate cartridge, while the M60 general-purpose machine gun solved all the problems haunting wannabe light machine gun rifles, like the M15 and BAR. The M60 was now purpose-built from the ground up as an actual light machine gun, with a disintegrating belt and a quick barrel change system, so the Browning automatic rifle could finally go into a well-deserved retirement. And before we wrap up, a big thank you again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. If you haven't already, go check it out for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile through my links in the pinned comments and description. New players and anyone returning after at least 6 months away will also get that massive bonus pack on PC and consoles, with premium vehicles, silver lions, premium account time, and more. But it's only there for a limited time, so don't miss it.